Mr. Chairman, dear colleague Pieper, thank you for your kindly words. Ladies and gentlemen, the concept of freedom in classical antiquity and Christianity is our topic. I have chosen a subject in the field to which much of my work has been devoted, the understanding of the two spiritual and intellectual forces on which our Western civilization is based, Christianity and classical antiquity, and the interrelationship of these forces. Since we cannot, of course, discuss the subject in its entirety, I have selected one aspect which seems to me of special interest and importance, the concept of freedom. The task of understanding this concept is an historical one. Therefore, let us first consider briefly what is the real purpose of historical research. Historical research attempts to reconstruct the past as clearly and interestingly as possible. But not only this. Historical research can also reveal certain laws, or better, rules, on the basis of which one can determine to a certain degree what actions should be taken in the future in politics or in society. But the ultimate profit from historical research is, as it seems to me, that it shows the possible ways in which man can understand himself, because all human actions originate from these various possibilities. These possibilities, as possibilities of human action, are never completely a thing of the past, but in fact always continue to be present in a certain sense. Therefore, genuine historical interpretation leads always to the decisive question: how should man understand himself? How should he understand himself in his world, in human society, in relation to the powers beyond this world, in the relation to God? It is in this sense that we consider the two intellectual forces, classical antiquity and Christianity. These forces, as they have determined Western culture, continue to be effective today, and therefore govern the way in which man understands himself. The question arises then whether the relation between man's self-understanding in classical antiquity and in Christianity is a simple either-or how could it be defined? It is, of course, impossible to describe fully in 1 hour the classical and the Christian self-understanding. As an introduction to our discussion on the concept of freedom, we will only mention the main characteristics briefly. We get an impression of these characteristics and the differences between self-understanding in classical antiquity and Christianity if we consider that in Greece a methodical science and philosophy developed which are outside of biblical thinking. Two phrases of the Greek philosopher Anaxagoras may show what this means with regard to man's self-understanding. When he, Anaxagoras, was asked why it was better to be born or not to be born, he answered, man is born to contemplate heaven and the order dominating the world, the cosmos. And the goal of life is contemplation, theoria in Greek, contemplation and the freedom growing out of it. From these words, two theses become clear. First, the real essence of man is intellect, that is to say, independent reason, which is able to recognize the unity and harmony of the cosmos. Secondly, man understands himself as a link in the cosmos, that is, as a part of the harmonious order. The Christian understanding of their self differs completely from this. According to Christianity, man does not have his organic place in the lawful ordered cosmos, but he has his place in history. His real essence is will, and the object of his knowledge is his responsibility for history, that is to say, for the heritage of history and for the future. This understanding is alien to Greek antiquity. To be sure, in Greece, the science of history first developed, but history was understood as analogous to the cosmic nature, in which nothing entirely new ever happens. Just like nature, history, according this this view, just like nature, history constantly repeats itself, also always in new constellations. Therefore, in Greece, no philosophy of history developed. That is to say, it never was discovered that history is something apart from nature, that it is a field for independent philosophical questioning. With this brief reference to Greek and Christian self-understanding, some important statements about the understanding of freedom are already made. The basic difference between the Greek and the Christian understanding of freedom is indicated by a simple example. We do find in the Old Testament, by which Christian thinking is largely determined, the idea of the free man as opposed to the slave. But we do not find any word which expresses the Greek concept of freedom. In the message of Jesus, according to the Synoptic Gospels, the word freedom does not appear. Later on, however, Paul takes the word freedom from the Hellenistic language and brings it into the Christian vocabulary. And in his theology, the concept of freedom is very important. Paul's use of the idea of freedom, which we will discuss shortly, makes evident the difference between the Christian and Greek understanding of the concept. In Greece, the concept of freedom has a rich history. Here as well in the Old Testament, the word freedom can, of course, have the meaning of freedom as opposed to slavery. But above all, it refers to political freedom, and not only in the sense of independence from a foreign power. Political freedom in this sense was, to be sure, a highly regarded freedom, and on behalf of it, the Greeks were ready to sacrifice their lives. But equally estimated was the freedom of the citizen within his city-state, his polis. For this reason, Aristotle defined the city-state, the polis, as the community of free men. Here, a peculiar dialectic becomes apparent. For the freedom of the citizen is not the arbitrary choice to do or not to do what one desires. Freedom is limited by the law, the nomos. And at the same time, what is even more important, freedom has its basis in the law, is constituted by it. For by the law, justice is established. Freedom is safeguarded by justice. But at the same time, the citizen is responsible for justice. Therefore, the freedom of the citizen includes personal freedom as well as responsibility for the whole community. This characteristic is valid, of course, for the classical Greek epoch. In Greece, we see the peculiar dialectic between freedom and law was understood correctly. This is a dialectic to which Goethe refers in his famous phrase that only law makes men free. One therefore perceives that genuine freedom is not to be found in a freedom to respond to the desires and passions of the moment, as one's arbitrary will might dictate. For in truth, such pretended freedom makes man dependent on what he craves and what attracts him at the moment. Man is free only if he makes decisions from an inner perspective. That means that man is free only when the motivation for his action lies beyond the immediate moment and has a deeper basis. And this again means that he is governed by a norm which gives direction to his decisions, by a law to be sure, but a law to which he agrees, because he can understand it as law which gives unity and meaning to his life. Man is free only in obeying such a law. In Platonic language, in obeying the idea of the good. This dialectic relationship between freedom and law applies not only to the political freedom of the citizen within the state, but beyond that, to the inner freedom, which shapes the character of the noble, the high-minded man. This is a freedom which stands in contrast to the enslavement that comes from all vulgar and common behavior. The law of honor is a law which is dialectically related to this inner freedom. This idea of freedom was developed further to mean independence from everything which can threaten or limit man's inner security. This means freedom from the standards set by society, from the social situation, and also from everything which may affect man's physical existence. For instance, illness and want, imprisonment and death. The idea of inner freedom was first developed in full detail by the Stoic philosophers at a time later than one we are now discussing, but in the period of classical Greece, the behavior of Socrates was a model for this idea. And even earlier, in the writings of Anaxagoras, there was evidence of this idea. This early Greek philosopher said, as we have seen, that the purpose of life is contemplation, that is, contemplation of the cosmos and the freedom originating from it. It is the law of the harmonious order of the cosmos that stands in dialectical relationship to his freedom. The man who recognizes the law of the cosmos by contemplation at the same time knows himself as a part of it. He is in harmony with it. Through this harmony, man wins freedom. This understanding of freedom was further developed, as I have said, by the Stoic philosophers at a later time. This is a constant theme of the discourses of Epictetus, who endeavors to bring this freedom to man's consciousness, to educate him to the point that he submits to the great law of the cosmos, the law of providence. This word, providence, does not appear in the New Testament, but for Epictetus, it is the law of God, whom Epictetus honors as his father. May I give some examples of Epictetus' views of freedom? About the man who considers that he is the son of God, Epictetus asks, why should he be afraid of anything that man could do to him? If we are related to the emperor or to some important person in Rome, then we feel security and we are proud and without fear. How much more should we be free from suffering and fear when we recognize God as our Creator, Father, and Guardian? And another quotation from Epictetus: do you want to seduce a wise man by money? He will despise it. What value has passionate love for him? What value darkness? What value for him has glory or shame? What value for him has praise? What value death? He can be victorious and triumphant over all. After Epictetus describes providence as that which manifests itself in the purposeful order of the nature, he says, is this now all that providence has done for us? Indeed, and what words are adequate to praise and glorify it fittingly? Why, if we were reasonable, dare we do anything else except sing, praise, and proclaim the manifold grace of God, all of us together and each for himself? Should we not, in spading and ploughing, in eating and drinking, sing the praise of God? Great is God. He gave us the tools with which we can cultivate the land. He gave us hands and gave us the ability to eat and to digest, to grow up without being conscious of it, and to find refreshment in sleep. Thus, whatever we are doing, we should sing. But the noblest and most godly song we should sing in thanks that he gave us the ability to understand these gifts and to use them in the right way. The presupposition for these ideas expressed by Epictetus is that man has power over himself. Man's essence is reason, his power of reasonable thinking. The thinking has in itself its own law, which cannot be disturbed by outside events. Now, what is admitted as reason is transferred to the individual. To the individual being, because the essence of the being is reason. The being is free and can find its freedom in surrendering to the cosmic reason, for the individual reason is identical with the cosmic reason. Freedom, therefore, is a quality of man as man, which, to be sure, he must always realize by thoughtful understanding of the cosmic law and by assenting to it. We cannot therefore be surprised that here the problem of free will does not appear. The problem, that is, whether man has power over his will. In Greek thinking, it goes without saying that will wants always what is good, what is beneficial, and that will does also what it holds to be the good. It is reason which knows what is good and communicates it to the will. Therefore, since reason is free, the will is also free. Evil deeds happen only by error, and error is removed through reasonable thinking and instruction. The Greek word which denotes sin means really to fail. That is to say, to miss the goal at which every man aims, and which he may fail to reach through error. May I cite again a characteristic example from Epictetus. He says, every failure contains some discrepancy. He who fails has failed to aim correctly. Then it is clear that he has not done what he wanted to do. You must point out the discrepancy to the reasonable man, and he will overcome it. Perhaps this statement will remind some of you on the words of Paul, I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. In addition, the earlier statements of Epictetus about the superiority of the wise man over faith also remind us of Paul. Paul also knows the inner freedom, the independence of man from fate. All things are yours, whether life or death, or the present or the future, all are yours. The Stoic philosopher can triumph as a victor over everything that happens to him in the same manner Paul, in the face of all difficulties and the distresses that happens to him. And the same he can say, in all those things we are more than conquerors. And just as well as a Stoic philosopher, he can acknowledge his freedom. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be enslaved by anything. The statements in which Paul expresses his inner freedom remind one indeed of the Stoic philosophers, and it is possible that Paul's statements are influenced by Stoic formulations. But the meaning is different. Wherein lies the difference? The difference is that, according to Paul, The real being of man is not reason, not knowing reason, which has power over itself. No, it is the will of man. This means at the same time man becomes what he is in essence by his decisions. For will is acting on the decisions of man, and these decisions are brought about by encounters with other persons as well as with fate. What man becomes at any given moment depends on which road he has chosen through his former decisions. When man is confronted with the need to make new decisions, he is, so to speak, asked whether he will remain who he was or whether he wants to become a new man. This implies that man is understood as an historical being whose essence is not to be fully comprehended by the fact that he is bestowed with reason. No, his essence is shaped by his decisions, that is to say, by his history. And this again means that man's essence always stands before him as a future one, for his history always leads through new decisions, assuming that he has not bound himself by his former decisions to such a degree that he has lost his real historical authenticity. Freedom, therefore, is not a quality which man owns as man, but freedom is a possibility which can only from time to time come into being as an event. That means the concept of freedom is an historical one. Now, the great question is, when does freedom become a reality? For if we assume that man is already shaped by his former decisions, then the question arises whether his future decisions are also already determined, and this to such a degree that a real new decision, as demanded by new encounters, cannot be made. It is a question whether man is bound by his past, out of which he comes into the here and now, whether he is bound to such a degree that he has lost his freedom. That this is so is in any event the opinion of Paul. Therefore, it is only an illusion that Paul and Epictetus have the same point of view in the statements quoted before about the discrepancy between will and doing. The statement of Epictetus is an appeal to reason to be conscious of its superiority and to realize its power, whereas Paul's statement says that man has no power over himself. To be sure, it can be said that the degree to which man is determined by his past is always relative. But with this, one says at the same time that his freedom is also relative. The man who will be really and totally be free must be free from his past, that is, from himself, as he has been shaped by his past. He must, so to speak, step out of the course of his life and take his stand in a place where he can make a decision in total independence. Is there such a possibility? There is, in the opinion of Paul. According to him, man is totally bound by his past, and this tie to the past means that only a relative freedom is possible, but not real freedom. Paul recognizes that the reason for the total determination of man by his past is that man basically wants to stay as he is, that he basically does not want to be free. For freedom would be the complete surrender of man, the insight that man finds himself just in losing himself. It would be the unconditional openness without reserve toward all encounters, toward everything that may come to him, everything that God sends. To be open to everything that man encounters means to renounce himself in order to receive himself, to renounce himself in order to receive himself as a gift from the future. Only this openness is freedom. Only out of this openness a really free decision can be made. But in what way can this freedom be attained? According to Paul, we must ask, what is the power which makes man free from himself, from the self which is shaped by his past? This power is the grace of God revealed in Christ. It makes a new man out of the old man, because it is the grace of forgiveness. For the tie which the old self, the tie with which man himself agrees, this tie is sin. The forgiveness of sin means just this, that grace is the death of the old self and the resurrection of the new self. Freedom is bestowed upon the man. He opens himself to the grace of God in faith. Therefore, this freedom is not a quality of man. Only as an event can it be realized in the man who lives by the grace of God. Freedom is, therefore, not even an inherent quality of the faithful man, not an inherent quality of a faithful man. He cannot take possession of it. There is no possession of grace. Grace can only be received ever anew by him who looks up in faithful readiness. Therefore, it is impossible that the Greek dialectic of freedom and law existed for Paul, at least not in the sense that law creates freedom. On the contrary, according to Paul, law is based upon freedom. But what is the meaning of this statement? Surely, Paul says that grace makes man free from the law, that Christ is the end of the law, that the faithful are not under the law but under grace. But what is it, what Paul calls law? It is, of course, not the law of the harmonious order of the cosmos. It is also not the law of the polis, the city-state. It is rather the demands of God, as they are formulated in the Ten Commandments. And summaries, in the commandment, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Commandments which are also known to the Gentiles. The intention of the law of God is to lead into life, Romans 7:10. Then we must ask, in what way is the law abolished by Christ? Insofar as the law is heard as thou must. The law, understood in this way, is misused by man in order to find security by fulfilling the commandments, and through this to make a claim on God, or, as Paul said, in order to establish one's own righteousness instead of receiving righteousness through God's grace. Just because the law, in the former sense, as thou must, just because the law in the former sense is abolished by Christ, it is restored to its original, genuine meaning, which means to bestow life. Now it can be fulfilled in genuine obedience without the aim of finding personal security. He who is free from himself by the grace of God is free for the commandment of love, the commandment in which the law is summed up. The thou must is changed into I will. The law is therefore based upon freedom, insofar as it has gained a new meaning for him who is made free from himself. As we have seen before, the Greek dialectic between freedom and law, in the sense that law creates freedom, is an alien idea to Paul. If Paul speaks of the law of Christ, however, it is possible for him also to speak of the law establishing freedom in a dialectical way. The difference is clear. Paul can speak in this fashion only because he can use the concept of law in a paradoxical way, as when he speaks of the law of Christ or of the law of the Spirit. The paradox is that standing in freedom under the grace of God is characterized as standing under the law because it is the law of Christ. It is very clear that here Paul speaks paradoxically, for the law of Christ had not the character of law, and obedience to God is in fact freedom. Now, then, how shall we finally define the relation between the Christian understanding of freedom and the classical? This question concerns basically only the question of inner freedom. The New Testament does not speak about political freedom and the freedom of the citizen in the city-state. The Christian faith is not directly interested in that aspect of freedom. Not directly interested, perhaps indirectly. We must consider that the grace which makes man free does not call man away from the world and its history, but it places him in the world and history in order to take responsibility for it. To be sure, this conclusion is not developed in the New Testament because the oldest Christian community expected the end of the world very shortly. But this consequence is implied in the genuine understanding of the grace which makes free. For if grace opens man's eyes for his encounters in life, it opens him for his concrete tasks in history. To those tasks belongs certainly the order of human society, political as well as economic. And this order can only be an order based on justice. The Greeks were therefore right when they understood the relation of freedom and law in the state as a dialectical one. In every constitutional state, it cannot be otherwise. The state is sound only when the freedom within it is based upon law, and when, on the other hand, the law is a law on which freedom is based. This law is understood in the Christian faith as belonging to the law of God, a law the intention of which is life. But of course, this freedom is not the freedom to which the grace of God brings men, for the freedom bestowed by grace is the inner freedom. Classical antiquity and Christianity meet each other in the idea of inner freedom, but at the same time they separate from each other. For in classical antiquity, the inner freedom is gained through the power of the reasoning independent man. In Christianity, freedom is a gift of the liberating grace of God. Thank you.